Okay, let's see. Looks like we've got 13 people on the webinar now. So yeah, Jennifer, I'm not seeing anybody else come in now. So if you want to kick things off whenever you're ready, I'm good to go whenever you are.
Awesome. Well, we just wanted to thank you guys for joining us for the third in our Wisdom Wednesday classes. We're really glad you guys are getting something out of this. Hope you enjoy the class today. Keep your eye out next week. We are having another class, another IFM class. It'll be an insurance class. So be sure to check your email and social media. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Take it away, Will.
Okay, sure. Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us virtually today. It's kind of strange to be doing these in the days of COVID. I've been teaching this class for a long time. I don't know if I've ever done it for the Gold Coast chapter, but I've done it for many, many different groups over the years. I'll just introduce myself real quick, and then we'll have a longer introduction within the class itself. But for those that I haven't met, my name's Will Simons. I'm going to be saying hello here on camera just for another couple of moments. I'll turn off my camera during the class itself just so you can focus on the slides. Want to say thanks to Jennifer at the Gold Coast chapter. Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate you putting this on. Hopefully we'll be able to do this again sometime soon. The class itself should run about 50 minutes or so, and we'll have time for Q&A after that. Like I said, with a fairly small group today, so hopefully we'll have plenty of time to get through any questions that you guys have. In order to do that, down at the bottom of your Zoom taskbar, there's a Q&A button. So if you want to just submit questions during the course of the class, that's fine. You don't need to wait until the end. So feel free to just pop in whatever questions you like, and then we'll run through those at the end of the class. Just as a reminder, this class is being recorded, so don't feel that you've got to be scrambling to take notes the whole time. You will get a chance to watch the whole thing over again. Typically what we do is record it to YouTube, and then we'll be sending out a follow-up email to all the attendees with a link to the recording. We're also going to send out a copy of the slides for the class, so don't feel that you need to ask for those. We're automatically going to send those out to everybody that was on the list. So feel free to share that with anybody you like. All of this is public information. Of course, the only people that are going to actually get the continuing education credit are the ones that are on the call today. But beyond that, if you've got colleagues or board members or other folks you think that might appreciate the information, feel free to send out the link and the slides to them as well. For the managers on the call, we will be submitting your credits to the DBPR as soon as possible, hopefully later today, even maybe tomorrow. I'll tell you in advance, they have been pretty slow to respond to us, and it seems that they're taking longer than normal to post those credits. So if you haven't seen them post to your account within a couple of days, don't panic. We are getting that to them. We'll also be sending a course certificate to all the CAMs on the line. So appreciate your patience. That may take a little bit longer than normal. I don't know if they're short-staffed due to COVID or what the deal is, but thanks for joining us. So with that, I'm going to switch off my camera. You all should be able to see the screen as of now. I'll jump back on camera at the end for our Q&A. But for now, let's go ahead and get this started. So here we go. Okay, hello, thanks again for joining us. This class is called Fundamentals of Reserves. The class is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit in either the insurance and financial management section or as an elective. I think we caught everybody on the registration form, but if you haven't already provided us with your first name, last name, and CAM license number, please be sure to do so. Otherwise, we won't be able to get you credit for today's class. Now, with that said, I don't want to give the impression that the class is only for managers. Board members, committee members, residents, really anybody should be able to get a great deal of information about reserves and budgeting and planning, and hopefully come away better prepared to lead and work with their communities. So like I mentioned, we'll be sending out a copy of the slides for this presentation. So you'll all be getting that in your email. There are a couple of slides with kind of some fine print and smaller numbers and things, but hopefully that'll be fairly easy to read after the fact. Okay. Before I get that going, I just want to take a moment. I'll introduce myself and our company in a little bit more detail. As I said, my name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. I've been with the company since 2008. Spent most of my career in Florida. We've had clients in the state going back to the early 1990s. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. That's an industry-specific credential that is only awarded to people who have demonstrated their expertise and experience in preparing reserve studies. That designation comes from CAI. I know you're all familiar with CAI, obviously. There's only been a few hundred people that have ever earned that credential over the last 20 plus years or so. Personally, I've lived in both condos and HOAs. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my own community in South Florida. I lived in Pembroke Pines. We had a budget there of over $1 million, about a 635 home community. The reason I always point that out is because I like to tell our clients and our attendees here that I know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, right? I've worked with volunteers and those boards and those committees, the people who are out there taking on the responsibility of managing their communities, which we know can represent hundreds of people and many millions of dollars worth of property value. So I know what it's like to be in your shoes. Who is Association Reserves? Basically, our company is the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in this business now since 1986, and we've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties and all around the world. We've got offices from coast to coast. We have more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other provider. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations. Obviously, that includes all types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, other types of residential properties. But we also have a great deal of experience with other property types. So things like office buildings, hotels, resort properties, schools, churches, you name it. One thing I always like to point out is that our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. Okay, we are not an engineering firm or an accounting firm. But rather we're a specialized consulting firm that's focused on doing one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. Now, the way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies that will help those clients to forecast and budget for major projects. If we do our job well and our clients follow the plans that we help them design, they should be able to reduce the risk of special assessments and bank loans and other types of financial distress that I'm sure you're all familiar with. So if you'd like any additional information about the company, our website is www.reservestudy.com. It's going to be right down there in the bottom right of these slides. You can also email me. We'll have my email address up on screen at the end, but that's W Simons, so WSIMONS @reservestudy.com. Okay. So this is basically what we're going to cover today. It's really just these two sections. Spend a bit of time in the beginning answering this sort of basic question: what are reserves? Seems like a simple question, but what I found is that that does actually require some explanation. And then we'll spend the majority of the class reviewing reserve studies and how those are used by community associations to make sure they're on the right track with regard to long-term planning. Along the way, I'm going to show you some communities that we're not adequately funding. I always get a lot of good feedback that people find those interesting. The idea is we're going to show you some real world examples of what happens when reserves are ignored. So again, feel free to take notes as you go along. Submit those questions through the Q&A feature whenever you're ready, and we'll get this going. All right, I include this particular slide in all these presentations that I give because I think it illustrates a very common reaction or mindset when it comes to long-term planning, okay? What we see out there and what I'm sure you might see amongst your community members is this reluctance to embrace the responsibility of long-term planning. And I think this guy here represents that typical attitude that we see when it comes to thinking about budgeting and about reserves. So if you look at this guy, you notice a couple things. He's got his eyes closed, fingers crossed, you know, kind of this pained, stressed out look on his face. And if there's one message that I'd like you all to remember from the class today, it's that, we all have a responsibility to go out to those communities that we work with and to help them get over that mindset. Right? We have the responsibility as professionals in the field or even as board members to educate the people around us, not let excuses get in the way, and really help people to help themselves, help them to take action to improve their communities. So we'll again start with this sort of basic question. Again, what are reserves? And For those of you who have been in the field for a while, this slide's going to be fairly elementary, but for those who might be newer to this profession or not used to drafting budgets, we'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about the two main aspects of a community association's budget. Basically, that budget can be categorized into two main sections. Okay, you've got your operating fund and your reserve fund. First, we'll talk about the operating fund. Now, operating money is essentially there for your routine costs of what I always call running the business of the community. These are your daily, weekly, monthly types of expenses for things like utilities and insurance, payroll, preventive maintenance, contracts, so on and so forth. If you want to think of things in personal terms, you can think of the operating account sort of like your own personal checking account, right? Operating funds are unrestricted, which means that you can spend that money on any bill that the association has to pay. And typically what you see is that money is going to be spent in the same year that you collect it. So what that means is if you've designed a good budget, hopefully you don't have any large surplus or deficit at the end of the year. And basically you're spending all of the money that you've collected within a given fiscal year during that same year, okay? Now, on the other hand, you've got your reserve account. Reserve account or accounts, those are there for the long-term expenses that the association will have to pay for. Some of those expenses may not happen for 5 or 10 or maybe 25 years at a time, but when they do occur, those might be some of the biggest bills the association will ever have to pay. Okay, your reserve funds are going to be used for things like roof replacement, painting buildings, pavement resurfacing, lots of other projects we'll talk about later on. Some of the other differences between operating and reserves is that reserve funds are restricted. So what that means is that once you put a dollar into a reserve account, it can only be spent on specific things, okay? Not any random project or cost that the association might have to pay for. Another difference is that in contrast to the operating fund, reserve money will accumulate. So sometimes taking place over many years, but it's going to build up an account balance until the time comes when it needs to be spent for its intended purpose. Okay, so going back to the analogy of personal finance, you can think of your reserve account functioning more like a long-term savings account that you might have as an individual. Okay, on this slide here, I've got a short excerpt from Florida statutes. Specifically, we're looking at a section of the statute 718 known as the condo statute. And what I've highlighted in red here is the portion of the text that talks about what associations must be reserving for. So if you look at that section, what you see is the statute requires that condo associations reserve for 3 things in particular, and then they add in one general definition at the end. Okay, so the 3 things they name specifically being roofs, painting, and pavement resurfacing. And then the general sort of catch-all definition they have at the end is, for any other item with a replacement cost exceeding $10,000. Now, you might be wondering, why did they pick $10,000? I've been teaching this class for a long time, and I've asked this question in front of many, many different audiences. Nobody's ever given a clear answer as to why the number is $10,000. So why didn't they make it $1,000 or $25,000? Nobody knows as far as I can tell. My guess is that way back when they wrote the statute, they just picked a number that sounded high and said, yeah, let's go with that. But the point is here that the $10,000 number is actually totally arbitrary. And for many associations, if not most associations, that number is probably too high of a threshold to set. We'll talk about this later in the class, but there's a more appropriate way to look at that dollar amount. And I feel that you could just ask the question, what is a financially significant number to this association or to my association? And oftentimes that might be a number less than 10,000 bucks. Okay, this slide here, I've got a portion of the statute pertaining to HOAs. HOA statute 720 actually has even less to say about what you should be reserving for in a community association. So, in contrast to the condo statute, this HOA statute does not have any specific checklist of items that would need to be included. Instead, pretty much all that it says is that, hey, there are certain things that the association is responsible for, and if you don't have reserves, it could result in a special assessment, okay? Now, the good news is that there's actually a much more realistic and thorough way to go about defining what any association should be including in its reserve planning. We'll talk about that in just a little bit, but for now, just want you to keep this fairly basic definition in mind, okay? Reserve money is there for an association to save over a long period of time for major repair and replacement projects. Now, it's important to point out what I did not say, okay? I didn't say that you could spend reserve money on capital improvements, on paying a insurance deductible, or for any other purpose. So for example, let's say an association does not have a playground, but all of the residents in the community really want to put one in. Okay, the grandkids are coming over all the time. It would be a great feature, great benefit for the community. Now that could be a totally worthwhile and smart thing to do, but they could not use reserve money for that. Okay, that would be adding a new element to the association, and it would have never been considered in any of their prior year budgets. So any prior reserve contributions would have never taken that construction cost into account. Okay, again, in reality, it might be a great thing to do, but the initial expense for that playground would have to be paid by some other means. Okay, now going forward, once the playground was in place, then the association should start reserving for it and thinking of long-term replacement cycles for the equipment and fall surfaces and fencing and that kind of thing. But again, just that initial cost of installing the playground in the first place, that would not be eligible for reserves. Okay, now this is kind of getting into the fun part. That's the end of that first section, and a couple of times during this class I'm going to break things up a little bit. I'll take you through what I fondly call our Hall of Shame. Every single one of these pictures you're going to see is an example of what can go wrong when associations are not properly funding the reserves. I've taken most of these photos myself. Some of them were provided by our other staff members, but every one of these is a real life client that we've worked with. The reason I'm including these is not to make fun of these communities or to kick them when they're down. I'm simply using these just as a cautionary tale. I want to show you what happens when communities don't take financial responsibility and aren't thinking about the long-term consequences of those budgeting decisions. So one of the key points here that I like to make, and which you'll see coming back in some of these photos, is that reserve funding is not only about fixing what is broken. Okay, it's I think a very important concept to keep in mind, which is the idea that property value can be greatly affected by the aesthetics of the common areas in the community. Okay, it's not enough to just ask whether something is functional or not. Instead, the question should be, are we doing all we can to try and make this an attractive place to live? And I would say that's both physically and financially, not only for our current owners, but for potential buyers as well. All right. So the first picture here, obviously pretty nasty looking roof. Distinctly remember walking up on this roof and having to watch my steps so I didn't flood my shoes, you know, a couple inches of standing water up there. Obviously that's not what a flat roof should look like. If you just think about the weight of all that water for a moment, just imagine the weight of that water, and you can imagine just holding a gallon of water in your hand. All that weight is going to be pressing down on the roof surface, and it's just a matter of time before it's going to find its way into the building and start causing more problems. So certainly something that needs to be corrected as soon as possible. This next one here, this is bad for a couple of reasons. What you're looking at here is called a mansard roof. It's a architectural style where the roof shingles are on the outer perimeter of the building, very steep. And I remember taking this photo too, looking up, wondering if I even wanted to get any closer to the building. Okay, it's a 3-story building as I recall. All of those shingles, you can see some of them there in the photo, really just hanging by a thread. Not hard to imagine that one of those pops loose just as somebody's walking underneath it, right? That could be anybody. It could be the mailman, could be a landscaper, could be somebody's grandson. But the point is that not only those shingles, that no longer they're protecting the building anymore. They're not really doing anything physically, but they also look terrible. And on top of that, I would say an accident waiting to happen. So, you know, a failure for a couple reasons there. What you're looking at now, this is a seawall that has clearly failed. Metal sheet pile seawall, basically turning to dust after a couple of decades of salt water and air exposure. At this point, I think this client was planning to really just abandon this portion of the property and kind of let it go back to nature. But again, that's the result of them not having adequate funding over the years to take care of what they had. Okay, on this one, I would give the client a little bit of credit here. They're attempting to do the right thing, but this is an example of just too little too late. So if you look closely at the photo, what you see is this advanced pattern of deterioration and cracking in the pavement. Call that alligatoring because it looks like an alligator's back, right? You can kind of see it right here in this photo or this portion of the photo very clearly. By any definition, this pavement is failed. But the additional mistake that the client made here was to try and put new asphalt on top of the old deteriorated surface, right? They just tried to put a fresh layer, and you can actually see that here in the photo. Didn't do them any good whatsoever. This is just throwing good money after bad because whatever they spent on that new asphalt without milling and removing the old surface, total waste of money. Again, I would give them points for trying, but what you see is that pattern of cracking reflecting upward through the surface pretty quickly, probably within a year, maybe 18 months of that new section going down. Okay, this is the last one in the section for now. I always think this one's kind of funny because I'm not sure how anybody could ever let it get this bad. Let's say you're walking down the street in this HOA. What are the options when you get to this point, right? Option A, you stumble off to the left over here. Maybe you end up in the bushes. Option B, you've got to walk out into traffic to try to get around this tree. Not only that, but keep in mind that the ADA standard definition of a trip hazard is only a 1/4 inch rise. So again, you know, if somebody was doing routine inspections and preventive maintenance and taking good care of the community, this would have never happened. And it's, you know, it's one thing to laugh at that, and you know, for most people could probably navigate around that without too much trouble. But if you're in a wheelchair, if you're pushing a walker, if you're pushing a kid in a stroller, you know, that's going to be a severe impediment. So definitely something that that should have been addressed a long time ago. Okay, we're going to switch gears now. We'll start talking about reserve studies and how those are used by communities when they prepare their annual budgets. So first, I just want to establish the definition of the term reserve study, which again comes from National Reserve Study Standards. Those standards have been in place now for 20 years, actually over 20 years. They were initially adopted by CAI back in 1998. Basically, a reserve study is a tool to document, really, but it's a tool that does a couple of things. First, it identifies the current status of the reserve fund. And secondly, it provides a funding plan that gives guidance about how to deal with future expenditures. Okay, now notice what I didn't say. Okay, a reserve study is not an insurance appraisal, it's not a turnover study, and it's not an engineering report. It's a very particular document that contains some very specific content regarding the physical and financial elements of the community. There are 3 types of reserve studies. So if a property has never had one done before, the first thing you would do is what's called a full reserve study. So in that type, the provider is going to create everything totally from scratch. That'll involve a site inspection where the provider is going to take measurements, take photos, basically gather up all of the raw data that will eventually become the component list for that property. Now, after you've had that initial full study done, there are 2 types of update studies that could be done. The first type is called an update with a site visit. And in that case, there's a new site inspection taking place, but it will be based on the existing component list, right? So in that case, you're trying to identify any significant changes in life expectancies or cost estimates based on the new current conditions of the property. There are some states that require those types of updates at specific intervals. So a couple of good examples would be California's every 3 years, state of Washington is the same, Virginia's every 5 years. But generally speaking, whether it's mandated or not, it's an industry best practice to have that done about every 3 years or so. Okay, now the last type of study is called an update with no site visit, which is exactly what it sounds like. Still results in a whole new reserve study document, but in that case, instead of conducting a new inspection, And that time, the provider will be just corresponding with the board of directors or the property manager to find out what projects have taken place or what new information is available since the last time anybody was still on site or was on site to do a evaluation. Either of these updates is going to result in a whole brand new document, totally new financial analysis, new funding plan, new recommendations. It's just a matter of whether or not it'll be based on a fresh site inspection or not. Okay, there are two parts to a reserve study. Those are called the physical analysis and the financial analysis. The physical analysis portion of the study is where someone comes out to do that on-site visual inspection of all the common areas. It's going to include everything from the roof to the mechanical rooms, the amenities, the lobby areas, basically anything and everything that the association is responsible for needs to be evaluated. Obviously, that includes taking lots of measurements, taking photos, documenting model and serial numbers for equipment, doing whatever it takes to get that raw data related to each component, which will eventually be used to determine the life expectancy and eventually the replacement cost. Now, during this physical analysis, it's usually very smart, very worthwhile for the provider to meet with a representative from the property. That could be a board member, a manager, a committee, but the idea there is to try and collaborate. We want to collaborate with the representatives of that property to gain from their insight and get the background of their experience of living there, working there, understanding what are the main concerns within that community. Second part, again, is the financial analysis. So that's the part that takes place back at the office where we organize all the raw data that came from that site inspection and we start to analyze it. This is where you'll research particular costs, project history, start comparing that information with the experience working with similar properties, and hopefully start filling in some gaps and drawing financial conclusions. There are 3 outcomes to a reserve study, which the client gets at the end of the process. We'll go through these one at a time. The first outcome is called the component list. And the word component in this context really just means some instance where the association will spend money. Okay, so a reserve component could be a roof replacement project, swimming pool resurfacing, a lobby remodel, whatever it is. For each component, there are 3 key pieces of information that need to be determined. First up, we need to determine the useful life of that component. Now, what I mean by that is its overall lifespan, or how long is it going to be in place from start to finish, either from when it was originally installed or when it was most recently replaced until that needs to be done again. Now, the second estimate, the second data point, is its remaining useful life. Now, that number is going to be determined relative to a certain point in time. So for example, let's say you've got a component with a useful life of 10 years, and as of this fiscal year, it's about 3 years old. In that case, you would say that as of this fiscal year, its remaining useful life should be about 7 years, okay? Now, lastly, we need to come up with an estimate for its replacement cost. And I've been asked over the years if the word replacement really matters here. So to be clear, you don't always have to be fully replacing something to justify it as a reserve component. You could just as easily say upgrade, remodel, modernize, resurface, something else. The point is, don't get too hung up on the word choice. Instead, just focus on the need to spend money to keep a component providing value to the association. Okay, so at this point, you might be wondering how we determine what belongs on that list. And earlier I gave you the Florida statutes and what they have to say with respect to reserve budgeting. But at this point, I want to give you a different approach. Okay, most professional reserve study providers will be using this 4-part test that comes from National Reserve Study Standards. This is more of an open-ended definition of what a reserve component should be. And the beauty of the 4-part test is that it can be applied to any different type of community. So instead of going into a project with some kind of predetermined checklist, you go in with open eyes, looking for anything there that might meet this criteria. Okay, so we'll talk through these 4 parts one at a time. First part here is that the component in question has to be the association's responsibility. I think that's pretty straightforward. An example of something that might fail this part of the test would be something like the windows and doors in a condo building. So I would say at least 99% of the time when we read the declaration and the condo docs, the individual unit owners are responsible for replacement of their own windows and doors. Okay, so in that case, we don't need to include them in the funding plan. If you're talking about an HOA where the roads are maintained by the city or by the county, then obviously no need to include any funding for road repaving. All right. Second part of the test here is that the component has to have a limited useful life. Okay, now in our world, we don't use the word forever, but if something should last indefinitely and there's no timeline where you would expect to replace it, then it really shouldn't be considered in your reserve plan. Okay, as an example, you might think of something like the foundation or the structure of a building or the conduit inside the walls. Those really should last the life of the property, however long that might be. And so therefore you would not be actively funding for their replacement. At that point, it's more likely that some developer is going to come in and knock down the building and build something new than you would ever be likely to have to replace those things, okay? The third part of this test is maybe the most complicated, which is the component has to have a predictable remaining useful life in order for it to be appropriate to include that in the reserve funding plan. The key word here is predictable, and to be more specific, what I mean is predictability in terms of scope and frequency, okay? So if you can't, in other words, if you can't reliably predict how much money you'll spend on something or how often, then it's probably not a good idea to handle it through reserves. I'll give you a quick example. A lot of clients will ask us, hey, can we include our insurance deductible as part of our reserve plan? It's a really big number. We're scared that one day we're going to have to pay that. And so we'd like to start saving up for it and listing it as a reserve component. Now, our response whenever we get that question is, well, what should the useful life be in that case? In other words, how often are you going to have to pay that deductible? And of course, nobody knows. That's the whole reason you have insurance in the first place. These expenses will come as a surprise as a result of some natural disaster, a hurricane, a fire, and to make some arbitrary prediction about how often that's going to happen is really getting away from the point here. It's getting away from being a responsible planner. Now, that's not to say that we don't recommend that you have some kind of plan in place. After all, this is Florida. There will definitely be hurricanes over the years. The problem is just that we don't know how often or how severe and whether or not you'll have to pay that deductible. So there's really no way for us to responsibly tell a client how often that expense will occur and therefore how they should be funding for it. In those cases, normally what we'll tell them is that it might be a good idea to have some kind of third account for the association, right? We talked about the operating account for your routine expenses. You have your reserve account for all the components that do meet this criteria. But then in addition to that, maybe it's a good idea to establish some kind of emergency fund or an emergency line of credit even, some combination of the two that could be available to the community in the event that you do need to pay that deductible. The problem, again, with listing it as a reserve component is that you're ultimately going to be basing some funding calculations off of the timeline of expenses. And if those expenses don't fall in line with the plan, then all of your calculations are going to be thrown off. Okay. Now let's just say that we assume a useful life of 10 years for paying your insurance deductible. So we're assuming that we'll get a major hurricane every 10 years. But then what happens if you get 3 storms in a period of 5 years and you're expecting that your reserve account is going to fund the deductible each time? In reality, what's more likely to occur is you're going to pull money away from your other reserve components that do have a predictable lifespan, which is probably going to end up resulting in special assessments to make up for those shortfalls. Okay. I know we're covering a lot here on this one slide, but the last criteria in that 4-part test is this, does that component represent a significant cost to the association? And we talked earlier about the statutory number of $10,000, but again, that's an arbitrary number in my opinion. In our experience, for most associations, that threshold should or could be set much lower. The advantage to doing it that way is that yes, you will have more components listed in your reserve schedule, but that will in turn take the pressure off of the operating budget, which would otherwise be the only place that could absorb those costs when they come along. So if you think about a smaller association that might have something like 6 projects that cost $5,000 each. Okay. Now, technically speaking, they would be compliant with the statutes if they left those projects, those components out of their reserve plan, because individually their costs are less than $10,000. But let's just assume, bad luck, that all of those 6 projects happen to occur around the same time. Well, collectively, now we're talking about a total expense of $30,000 that they would have to try to squeeze into the operating budget for that year. And you can imagine that if cash flow is a little bit tight, that can be a tough situation, especially for a smaller community. But again, if they had listed them in the reserve schedule, now they have the ability to spend reserve money on those things, and hopefully that's less disruptive to the community. Okay, so the point here is that there's no one number that will be appropriate for any and all associations. Okay, on this slide here, I drew this little red bracket around the top 3 components because those are the only ones that, again, are specifically mentioned by the Florida statute, particularly 718. But if you look down the rest of this list, you'll see a lot of other components that we routinely include in the reserve study. I know the statute has their definition, that kind of general statement at the end, anything over $10,000. But what we find is that the problem is that many associations are not really aware of just how much things cost. So just to give you some idea for your own experience, I would say that for a smaller, simpler townhome style community, let's say, you could have 15 or 20 individual components on the list. But if you're talking about a luxury high-rise or some other big complicated property, it's very easy to get up to a point where you maybe have 50, 75 components, if not more. Okay, so if you're a manager, if you're on the board of a high-rise building and your reserve schedule only has half a dozen things on it, that's a huge red flag, right? I can immediately think just of 6 mechanical systems alone that would certainly be more than $10,000. Okay, so jump back into the Hall of Shame here. I think this one pretty much speaks for itself. Wooden fence that's just hanging on by a thread, probably going to get knocked over with the next, next little puff of wind. This is another fence example. This one is around the perimeter of a pool area, okay? Now, in this one, this was an HOA community where you've got kids just running around all over the place. The fence is about 4 feet tall, just the right height for kids to try and jump over it. If you've ever had a pool, you know that, after dark, kids just want to, jump into the pool. Pretty easy to imagine somebody ending up with a pretty nasty cut there. Not to mention, of course, an eyesore. I always say, imagine being a realtor trying to give a tour of the community. And if this is what your client sees when they walk into that clubhouse and pool area, what does that say about the property? Okay, if the fence is deteriorating this bad, again, an eyesore, an aesthetic issue, but it's probably not even very secure in the first place. So if the purpose of the fence is to keep people out of the pool, especially if you got young kids, that can again be a major liability issue. This should be a huge priority to get that fixed. Okay, this next one here is pretty interesting. This is a boiler that actually had caught on fire at some point. Luckily, the fire must have snuffed itself out before it blew up the boiler room and took a chunk of the property with it. The reason I include this is because clearly the association was not doing a good job of routine inspections and preventive maintenance. In fact, when we did this reserve study, we were the ones to actually discover the situation that happened and had to go back and tell the property manager. Clearly kind of illuminated the fact that they weren't doing a good job of preventive maintenance and checking in on their equipment. Again, point is, if you're not doing the little things right, very hard to do the big things right in a community association. Okay, this last one here has a bit of a story to go with it. This is the bathroom at a clubhouse, and I will not anytime soon forget the experience of walking into this property. First of all, it was padlocked from the outside, and from what I understand, pretty soon after our inspection, the entire building had to be condemned. I was walking through the property with a board member who was an original owner in the community. I think it was built sometime in the 1980s. And I'm talking with the board member. She's telling me that, back in the day, their clubhouse, their community's clubhouse, was this jewel of the neighborhood, right? It was the type of place where kids would have birthday parties. They would all get together for a big New Year's Eve party. I think she said they even hosted a couple of weddings at some point, right? The point is, it was this great asset to the association and even to the neighborhood at large, even to the surrounding community. But what happened over the years was that the residents wanted to focus on keeping the dues low and cutting from the budget wherever they could. So they essentially stopped funding the reserves for the amenity areas. And eventually they couldn't keep up with the maintenance costs for the clubhouse. Nobody was going into it, so it kind of became this hideout for vagrants, people doing drugs in there. You can see from the photo how that ended up looking. To me, this is really sad, really interesting case, because it basically ran the whole spectrum. It was this great asset to the community and eventually became a total liability, something they had to completely abandon and get rid of. So when people ask, why are reserves important? Why should we care? This is one of those stories that always just pops back into my mind. Okay, back to those outcomes that you get from a reserve study. We'll talk about the second one, which is this notion of an evaluation of current reserve fund strength, which is often described in terms of what we call percent funded. Okay. One of the best ways I've found to explain percent funded is to use the analogy of a credit score. Okay. Now, we've all had our credit reports pulled. We should all know what our credit scores are, give or take. To an outside party like a bank or a credit card company, your credit score is an indicator of what kind of risk you are. Now, in the same way, if you think that the reserve study itself is something like a credit report, and you have to distill it down to one key result, that would be percent funded. Okay, we measure it on a 0 to 100% scale, and we consider anything between 0 and 30% funded to be a weak position. So in that range, associations will have a much higher likelihood of special assessments and other types of cash flow problems. Now, once you get above 30%, we consider that to be a fair range. Still a moderate risk, but it's not an emergency anymore. Where you really want to be, though, is above 70% funded. That's where we see that there's a very low risk of those financial problems. So again, putting it in kind of credit score terms, being above 70% funded could be having a credit score of something like 720 or above. It doesn't have to be perfect, but to most third parties, most people looking at that, they would say that's a fairly good risk, a decent position to be in. Okay, talked about percent funded as a concept. Now we'll talk about how it's actually calculated. The idea here is pretty simple. All we're doing in these cases is looking at how much money an association has at a certain point in time, and then comparing that amount against how much money it should have at the same point in time. Okay, when we do that math, we can express that division, that comparison as a percentage. Okay. So first part of the calculation, pretty straightforward. When we're doing that reserve study or that analysis for a client, we're looking at their current financial statements and trying to look ahead to the start of the next fiscal year. Okay, so right now, pretty much everybody's starting their budgets and looking ahead to 2021. So let's say January 1st, 2021, how much money are we going to have at the start of next year in reserves? The second part, what we need to do next, is to compare that amount against how much money they should have. Now, this notion or this concept of how much they should have, that is an amount that we call the fully funded balance. Okay. Now, the fully funded balance is a theoretical number. Let me just make that clear. But the way I like to put that in perspective is to ask you a question. Okay, so if I told you that there's an association out there that has $50,000 in reserves, but I haven't told you anything else about the community, have I really told you anything at all? Okay, now I'll hear this sort of statement all the time from the board members and committees that we work with. They'll say something like, hey, our association's in great shape. We have $900,000 in reserves. We have $1.5 million in reserves. But I always have to point out to them, yeah, that definitely is a lot of money, but we don't know if it's adequate. We don't really know if it's enough until we have something to compare it against. Okay. Now, of course, that all depends on what type of property we're talking about. If you've got a little two-story building with no amenities, just a little parking lot, it might be that $50,000 is plenty of money for them. But if you're dealing with something like a high-rise, luxury building, that $50,000 is a drop in the bucket, right? That can be wiped out in one payment installment towards one project. Something like a concrete restoration, a paint job, a elevator modernization, all big ticket items. 50 grand is absolutely nothing when you put it in that context. Okay. Now we're going to take this one step further. I'm going to walk you through the steps here. How do we actually calculate the fully funded balance? Now, it's a fairly simple idea. We're basically just going to look at how old a component is compared to its overall lifespan, which will give us a fraction. We then multiply that fraction by the current estimated cost of the component, which tells us how much money we should have today for its eventual replacement. And when we do a reserve study, it doesn't matter if the association has 4 components or 400. We're just going to calculate the fully funded balance for each individual component and then add those numbers together. Okay, and that'll tell us the fully funded balance for the whole association. And once we've done that, now we would have something that we can use to look at the cash on hand and put that number in perspective. All right, so we'll run through an example together. Let's all pretend that we're on the board or we're managing this property. We'll call it Seaview Condominiums. And our task is to calculate percent funded for this association at the start of this upcoming fiscal year. Okay, now that you understand the concept a little bit, the first thing you have to do is establish the starting reserve balance for that fiscal year. So let's say that we've reviewed our financial statements, we talked to our bookkeeper, we've taken into account whatever spending is going to take place this year. We know how much money we're putting into reserves, and that will leave us with this starting point, let's say $60,000 going into the fiscal year. Okay. The next thing we need to do is to calculate the fully funded balance for each of the components of the property. And for the sake of this example, we'll just limit it to 3 things. So first up, we'll look at the roof. Let's say the roof is 10 years old with an overall useful life of 20 years. And let's give it an estimated replacement cost of $80,000. So again, keep in mind that the fully funded balance is only the proportion of the cost that we would need to have on hand today. So since it's halfway through its life, you only need to have half of the replacement cost saved up today because you recognize that you have another 10 years to collect the difference. So in this case, we'll take 10 over 20 and we'll multiply that by $80,000, which tells us that the theoretical fully funded balance for the roof as of right now is $40,000. Again, halfway through its life, so we only need to have half of the replacement cost saved up today. Look at the next example. We'll do the same thing for our gym equipment. Okay, if you assume that the equipment is 5 years old with an overall life of 15 years and a replacement cost of $30,000, then you know that the fully funded balance for that equipment right now should be $10,000, right? Makes sense. It's only a third of the way through its life, so you theoretically only need to have 1/3 of the replacement cost in the bank today. Let's do one more. So let's say we painted the hallways of the building 2 years ago, and we want to do that every 8 years. And let's give it a cost estimate of $100,000. So you divide 2 by 8, it's going to be 1/4 or 25% of the way through its life. If you have a cost estimate of $100,000, well, now you know that the fully funded balance for hallway painting would be 25 grand. Okay. Not so bad. Now that we know the starting reserve balance and we've just calculated the individual fully funded balances for each of those components, now you can calculate percent funded for the association as a whole. All right. So we'll take the 3 numbers that we just calculated and we add those together. So we'll take $40,000 for the roof, $10,000 for our gym equipment, and $25,000 for painting. If you add those 3 together, you'll get this theoretical fully funded balance of 75 grand. And now that you've done that, now you look back at the 60,000 in cash on hand and you make this determination that the community is 80% funded, right? 60,000 divided by 75,000. All right, before we move on, I'm just gonna talk about how we start to draw financial conclusions about associations based on their level of percent funded. Okay, so what you're looking at on this chart, this is the result of a huge internal analysis that we completed a number of years ago. What we looked at was a data set of thousands of associations. I think it might have been even 10,000. And we're looking at 2 variables. First, what was the percent funded level for that community? And then secondly, yes or no, did we include a special assessment recommendation as part of their funding plan? Now, obviously, the results were pretty much in line with what we would have expected. In short, the closer the association is to 0% funded, the higher the chances that we had to include immediate special assessments as part of that funding plan going forward. I'll make this point quite often to board members who are asking, well, why is this necessary? Why are we passing a special assessment? Well, the reason is that's essentially a catch-up contribution. That's more than likely the result of many years prior when you were not adequately funding your reserves. Now you're up against a major cost that you just hadn't been saving enough money for, and that's really the only natural result is you have to raise that extra money. Okay, a couple years later, we did another internal study. This time we were looking at the correlation between percent funded and property values within a community. The way we did this one was to look at a large data set. In this case, it was a metropolitan area of Southern California. And this time we looked at a group of properties that were all as similar as they could be in terms of size and age and amenities and so forth. We measured the market value of the homes in those communities, and what we wanted to know was what difference would it make when the associations themselves turned out to be in a better financial position. So to be specific, was there any sort of increase in property value that we would see when percent funded went up? Okay, so the first thing we did was to set a baseline, which was basically those communities that are in that weak position between 0 and 30% funded. We then looked at what happened to property values when, again, those comparable associations were in a fair position between 30 and 70% funded. So all else being as equal as possible, what we found was that the communities that were in a fair position had homes that were about 8% more valuable than those that were in the weak associations, okay? Now, the more interesting number, again, was that once you got into a strong position above 70% funded, the gain was almost 13%. Okay, so you can kind of see how that would be the case, right? The associations that have money in the bank tend to have better curb appeal, better physical condition, which translates into them being more attractive to potential buyers. So again, if we go back to one of those fundamental questions, why do you have reserves at all? Well, hopefully one answer is that it can actually boost your property values in the community. All right. We've got a couple of more slides in this Hall of Shame. I'm going to go through these just to save us a little bit of time. I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. I'll just stop here for a moment. This one is going to maybe be a little bit of a nightmare for those that have gone through concrete restoration, but I had to include this one. This is the one photo here that's not actually a client of ours. But when I walked by this, I had to just stop and look at this picture because this is what happens to concrete over time if you're not protecting it from the environment, okay? It's about as close as I wanted to get to the balcony, but I think the picture pretty much speaks for itself. Now, if you remember, it wasn't too long ago, I think 2 or 3 years back, there was a building in Miami where a balcony actually sheared off the side of the building. If I recall, it was a New Year's Eve party. There were maybe 6 or 8 people standing on the balcony at the time. Fortunately for them, this was only on the 2nd floor, okay? Now, the rebar structure holding up the balcony, kind of what you see, similar to these metal rods in there, that's concrete reinforcement, the rebar, those had disintegrated to the point that there was a sudden collapse and the balcony just popped off the building, fell onto a parked car beneath it. Now, amazingly and very luckily, nobody got killed, but I think a couple people might have gone to the hospital. Now, if that were your community, let's say you're on the board or you're the manager, how would you like to be on the phone the next day when those attorneys start calling and asking you what happened? Not a situation I'd like to be in. Okay, we'll switch back. We'll talk about our last point here, which is the third outcome from a reserve study, which is the funding plan. Now, if you think about the first 2 outcomes, we've talked about the component list, which is essentially, what are we reserving for? We then talked about percent funded, which tells us where the community stands as of this point in time. But now that you've covered those 2 things, the next question is, well, where do we go from here? Now, one of the things that we do when we're designing that funding plan is to look at the current budget and see, what would happen if the client just stays with that plan? What would happen over time based on their future expenditures if they just stayed on the path that they're on? Now, if it's not clear that their existing plan is going to work, then you have to make some changes, which we'll talk about. two of the other things I like to point out here is that the funding of reserves needs to be consistent with the timing of your overall assessments. So for example, if you have monthly dues in the association, there has to be a monthly reserve contribution. I believe by law it has to be made within 30 days. So in other words, what you cannot do is just operate throughout the year, hoping that, you know, at the end of the year you'll have some kind of surplus in your operating budget, which you can then drop into the reserve account and say, hey, we funded our reserves this year. It doesn't work that way. It has to be a proactive plan where you're funding it all the time. The last point to make on this slide is that in those cases, again, where the historical contribution rate has not been sufficient and that community is in bad shape, then unfortunately, sometimes there needs to be that initial special assessment that's part of the plan. And again, just to make that same point, it's a form of musical chairs, right? The music has stopped. You need a catch-up contribution that's going to, you know, bring a bunch of money in all at one time to make up for those years when your budgets were not sufficient. Okay, there's a set of kind of principles that we look at when we're designing those funding plans. I'll talk about these one at a time. First and foremost, as you look to the future and you start modeling those reserve expenditures, at the bare minimum, the amount of money that you put into reserves over that period of time needs to ensure that you will have some amount of cash on hand. That's actually the bare minimum requirement. That's something that we call baseline funding. It's pretty obvious if you don't have any money in reserves at some point in the future, you're essentially guaranteed to have special assessments or loans, which again, one of the things we're trying to prevent in the first place. So when you model out those future expenditures, if the contribution rate isn't enough, you're gonna bottom out. You're gonna hit zero, and you can't allow that. You can't propose that as a funding plan. Contribution rate to reserves also has to be stable. So what that means is that, for example, you can't have these huge spikes and decreases in the contribution rate over time based on some arbitrary fluctuations. Okay, it's not fair to assume that some future group of owners will be perfectly willing and able to double their reserve contribution overnight, making it easier on the owners who live there today. You're also not allowed to plug in any balloon contributions. So for example, if you've got a $1 million roof replacement project that's projected to happen 10 years from now, you can't just operate with this expectation that you can do the minimum amount of reserves in years 1 through 9 and then raise, you know, $950,000 in the last year to try to minimize the collections between now and then. Okay, you also don't take any years off. So for example, if you've just spent a huge amount of money doing something like an elevator modernization project, you can't assume that you won't have to do that again, even though it may not be for another 20 or 25 years. Doesn't mean that you stop funding reserves for elevator modernization. Even if it's got a long timeline, it's going to happen again, and you should begin funding for the next time around as early as possible, so as to spread the cost of the component over the longest period of time possible. The idea here is that the association membership should be paying for the deterioration of the components over their entire useful life, not just all at once, right, when something fails. Okay, if you do it that way, then everyone's paying their fair share, and it's not just the unlucky people who happen to live in the property when a certain component breaks down and needs to be replaced. Again, that's like that nasty game of musical chairs. Okay, now we've got, I think this might be our last slide, but this is maybe the most important principle to follow when you're designing your reserve funding plan, which is that it's got to be fiscally responsible. And what do we mean by that? Okay, that means being realistic, first of all, with respect to interest and inflation. It is not realistic to assume that you can earn 10% interest each year on your invested reserve funds. Unfortunately, we know that reserve money really can't be invested in anything very exciting. So that means you should be assuming a fairly low return on those funds. Now, with respect to inflation, you should also be realistic there too. What we found is that through historical data trends, if you look backwards over a long enough period of time, the average annual inflation rate tends to be about 3%. I think it's between 2.5% and 3%. Now, what that means, if you're assuming that the cost of a project 15 years from now will be the same as what it cost you today or what it cost you last time, you're likely to be way off, and that plan's just not going to work, okay? Now, the second point on the slide here speaks to being honest about the situation that you're in. Okay, so if the association has not historically done a good job of funding reserves, you have to address that. Okay, it's financially irresponsible to continue operating the way you always have just to try and maintain the status quo. Okay, in other words, it's not the job of the board of directors to make owners happy or to just keep the dues low compared to the building next door, right? Speaking of the owners, your reserve funding plan cannot be biased in favor of the people who live there now at the expense of the people who will live there later on, all right? Again, it's just that basic idea. You can't assume that somebody else is going to come along and pay the tab for you. And lastly, this all takes place despite what may have happened up to now. And this is a point I see all the time and something I reiterate to board members probably feels like every day. If your prior budget wasn't funding your reserves and the prior boards of directors have kicked the can down the road, that does not give you an excuse to kick it on down the road even further for the next group of owners, right? In a perfect world, all associations would have been carefully managed and guided over the years to this stable financial position, but in reality, that's just usually not the case. However, that does not in any way remove the obligation from the board of directors now to act responsibly and fulfill their fiduciary duty, okay? Having said that, at the end of the day, we recognize this is definitely a challenge for most communities. If an association has been operating for many years without funding the reserves properly, there's a very good chance they'll be in a financial hole that's going to be tough to climb out of. But it's really important not to put lipstick on a pig here. The owners in the community deserve to make an informed decision. Okay, and now having a reserve study done is a great way to make that possible. They need to know what happens if the reserves aren't funded properly and what are the risks that there will be special assessments and loans. When are those things going to occur? How much will they be? So that they can make an informed decision about which direction they want to go. Okay, so if you remember our guy way back in the beginning, eyes closed, fingers crossed, hoping for the best. I feel if I've done my job today with this class, you'll agree that that mindset is not a substitute for a responsible financial plan. And I hope you guys have all learned some good information today. I hope that helps you to go out and benefit the communities that you work with. And good luck, I guess is all I can say. So that is the end of the class. We can open it up now to any Q&A. So let's see what we've got here. And I will turn my video back on so I can see you guys again. Hello out there. All right, I didn't have any preliminary questions, so this is really up to you guys, however much you want to get through. We'll leave this open. I mean, if there are no questions, that's fine. If you're feeling shy today, that's fine. That's why I put my email address up there. So feel free to email me after the fact if you have a particular situation or something that you'd like to go over, and we can certainly help out. So let's see what we've got. Okay, Ingrid, thank you for your question. How much does a reserve study cost? So basically the cost of a reserve study is going to vary depending on the type of property it is. A couple other variables, but basically the rule of thumb is that the more components you have, the more costly your reserve study, because it's more time. It's more time on site to do the physical inspections, more time putting together estimates and delivering all that to the client. So some of the other factors would be location. If you're in South Florida, that's one thing. If you've got a property down in the Keys, that's somebody's got to travel down there to do that work. So that can be a factor. I'll just give you a broad ballpark range. So what we think is that on average, most of the time we're dealing with a client for the very first time doing a full reserve study. The cost tends to be somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000. Now, the good news is that that's the cost of the full study. The cost of those updates after the fact can certainly be less than that. A no site visit update can be $800. It really just depends on the size of the property. If you're curious, I mean, and this is by no means a sales presentation, but we can certainly give you quotes on our website. If you go to reservestudy.com, I think it's up in the top right, there's a button that says request a proposal. So if you have a specific community in mind that you want to get some numbers for, just pop in your information and we'll be able to get those numbers out to you. Let's see, Michael Cox, thank you very much. Got your license number there, so we'll make sure we get you that credit. Let's see. Okay, I'll leave this up for another couple of minutes. If you don't have any questions, feel free to drop off the line at any time. Again, we're going to record this whole thing, so if there are any questions that come up, that'll be part of the recording that we post on YouTube, and you guys can get the benefit after the fact. So, Gloria, thank you. Got your CAM license number. Appreciate that. Thank you. And let's see. Okay. Yeah, I guess I'll just spitball a little bit. I know everybody's probably starting their budget process by now. So, good luck with that. Normally, those budgets need to be finalized between, October or certainly November at the latest. So now is a good time to start reviewing your contracts with all your vendors, dial in all your expected amounts for your operating budget. Typically that's the first part of the budget that you work with, and then looking at reserves. That's where we can help guide you on that side of things. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, we'll give it another couple of minutes. I still see we've got some folks on the line. So we'll give it maybe just another 2 or 3 minutes if there's any questions. I'm going to launch a poll for you guys if you wouldn't mind giving me some feedback. Everybody should be seeing that now. Just a couple of questions here about the course itself, about how we presented it. If there's any feedback you have there, we would certainly appreciate that. You can also email me if you have any specific topics or comments that you'd like us to address in the future. I do have another class which is called Reserve Study Roadmap for Managers, which is more of an advanced level class that builds on some of these topics. We get into the subject of straight line reserves versus pooled reserves, for example. So we teach that all the time. Jennifer, if you ever want to put that together, I'd be happy to do a follow-up. It's another IFM class. So if you're ever looking for those, we can certainly do that as well. So.
We appreciate it. We will definitely keep you on the list as we start planning our education for next year. We do have some exciting things coming out for the CAMs for that. So you guys should all keep your eyes open for that.
Great. Great. Okay. Let's see. I think we've had votes from just about everybody on the poll. And yeah, doesn't look like we have any other questions. So yeah, Jennifer, if you have any closing remarks, I'll leave it to you. Otherwise, I'll just say thanks again, and good luck to everybody out there.
No, I just want to thank everybody for coming. Keep your eyes out for the next Wisdom Wednesday. Next week is another IFM class about insurance. And you guys know where to find us if you need anything. Thanks for showing up.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, Will.
We'll be in touch. All right, take care.
Okay, bye.
Thanks.